Hi everybody, it's Pascal. Welcome to part 2 of our video series on how to get that worship drum sound. Before I take you through the mix, I'd like to note that everything I'm about to show you will apply equally to a studio situation where you might record drums for a worship song, or also for a live worship scenario. The only difference is going to be concerning the samples, but I'll get to that. So let's dive right in. Okay, so this is the Logic session that we recorded and mixed it in. As you can see up top, I have the original version of Waymaker and Gyro just for reference. Then I have the drumless versions of those songs. And then we have all of the drum mics. So we have an overhead left and right. We also recorded a hi-hat, but I didn't use it in the mix. Can be helpful to have it, but in this case I didn't need it. Snare top, snare bottom, and then I have one snare sample, but I made that sample myself. It is just one snare shot in the room, or from the room mics. I bounced that and used that to add to the snare sound. So I triggered the MIDI notes from the snare top mic, as you can see, here they are. And then I bounced the triggered sample as an audio file so that I could see if it lines up with the snare top mic to make sure they're in phase. This is something that obviously works well for studio situations, but in a live context you can just skip those steps. And then continuing on with the mics, like I said, I have snare bottom, I have a bass drum mic, one dynamic mic, rack tom, floor tom, and then a stereo room setup. And then, as you can see here, these are 3 buses or sends. This is just a bus which consists of these 2 room mics. Then I have a reverb send, into which the snare is going, and I think some of the toms, and then I have a drum bus. This is what it looks like in the mixer section. As you can see, we have the overheads here. They're panned hard left and right, and I'm using those as a basis for the kit. So they are EQ'd the same way. All I have on them is EQs, no compression. So the first EQ I'm doing here on the left overhead and the right overhead also is cutting some mids here. Let's take a listen. As you can see, this always pops up from the snare hits, and I'm removing some of that because it just makes it sound, or it sounds cleaner with that cut. Let's put it that way. Then I'm also doing a high boost at, in this case, roughly 12K. This is a cool region to boost some cymbals, at least for me. And I can also show you this just on this mic. So we go from this to this. So you notice the mids are a bit cleaner and also the highs are more present. And then the next EQ is removing some more of this mid region. This will also vary from room to room, but in this case this frequency annoyed me, so I took some more of that out and also boosted some more highs, in this case at 16K. You can also do this, just lift up the highs altogether. But in this case, I wanted to be a bit more precise than that and match my highs to those of the original songs. So that's what I did. So again, we go from this to this. This helps me get more of the cymbals from the overheads instead of a mix of the whole kit. The kit is still in there, but it's the cymbals are boosted because no other mics are gonna pick up the cymbals the way that the overheads do. And then it's the exact same thing on the right, overhead and hard panned. It sounds like this. The panning will obviously vary, especially when you're in a live setting. You might not want the overheads panned hard left and right, but the idea is still the same. One thing you could also do for the overheads is to actually low cut everything below, say, 5000 Hertz, which may sound very extreme, but it will make the overhead signal very clean and have just the cymbals on them. And then you can use the close mics to get the drums, which will make it easy and controlled, which especially in a live scenario could also help a lot. Okay, like I said, the hi-hat is off. In the beginning, I was trying to mix it in a bit. As you can see, I also have some EQ on that. It's a low cut and then some highs boosted. It sounds like this. But like I said, I had so much hi-hat, or actually just enough hi-hat on the overheads that I didn't need the close mic. Okay, next up we have the snare. Without the reverb and dry, it sounds like this. So it's a good blend of attack and fundamental, but it also has some mids in there that we might not want. And before we get to the EQing, I'd like to talk about this, which is the Logic Gain plugin, and I'm using that to invert the phase of the mic, because one thing that's obviously always happening is if you have multiple mics recording the same source of audio, the sound waves might not be in phase with each other. So in this case, what I did was I soloed the overheads and the snare mic, and then I flipped the phase in and out and used the version that sounded the best to me. So without this, the overheads and the snare sound like this. And then with the phase flipped, yeah, it's not a big difference at all, but it can sometimes help if the snare sounds a bit sluggish. You might want to try that and it might help. Okay, next up on the snare we have this kind of EQ. It's a very typical snare EQ that I would always do in kind of a similar way, no matter what snare it is. As you can see, the snare fundamental is here, and I'm cutting everything below that. I don't want any low-end information on the snare mic. I just want the snare. And the snare itself does not do anything below this region, so I'm cutting that off, which cleans it up already. Then I'm leaving the fundamental as it is for now, and then I'm also cutting some resonance frequencies here in the mid-range again that we also cut in the overheads. In this case, again around 350, minus 8 dB, and then minus 5 dB at 450 roughly. And then I'm also boosting 6.7K in this case, right around 7K usually is where snare attacks sound good for me at least. So in this case I'm boosting that around 4 dB. So we go from this to this. Next up we have the compression. The settings on here are also pretty standard for me, around 30 milliseconds of attack. In this case 150 milliseconds of release, and then a ratio of 4 to 1 roughly. And then I want the needle to move between 0 and minus 5 dB of gain reduction. So pretty light compression. And then also took the makeup gain down because I want the output level to be roughly the same with the compressor on and off. So we go from this to this. And you notice that this will slightly change, especially the attack. It will sound a bit more, yeah, just like you would hear in a final mix. Without the compressor, the attacks can sometimes be a bit peaky and not really fit in that well, and the compressor helps to even everything out and shape, especially the initial attack of the drum, in such a way that it will fit in the mix better. So we do this, and then next up we have something which Logic calls the enveloper. It's basically a transient designer, and it helps you shape the attack of the hit and also the release of the hit. In this case, I'm happy with the attack because we just took care of that with the compressor. And then for the release, I wanted to add just a little bit more initial sustain of the drum. So I'm adjusting the release knob here to around 70 milliseconds and boosting that 10%, which will give it just that bit more body and sustain. So let's check out what happens when I switch that on. It's just a bit fatter, so I like that. And then one more EQ. In this case, this was done especially to match the recording that we made to what is heard in the original of Waymaker and Gyra. So it's just another cut in the mids, in this case 625 minus 3.6 dB. You don't have to use this many plugins on a snare. You can also use just one EQ, one compressor, and be good with it. Most of what I'm doing here is especially to match my sound to the original. For a live scenario, you could just do one EQ, one compressor, and then send it into a reverb channel, and that's it. Especially in a live scenario, I think it's a good idea to not use too many plugins so that you know when something is wrong with the sound. It can only be this plugin or that plugin. You don't have to go through 5 different ones to find the one that is causing the problem. Okay, let's leave that for now. We'll get to the reverb later. Let's do snare bottom next, and then get to the samples. So on snare bottom, I'm also doing another pretty extreme low cut, in this case at 4.7K, because I want the snare wires to be just the wires. No mids or anything else on that mic, only the snare wires. This is what we had before. Lots of mids. And now only the wires. And then the other plugin on here is the enveloper. Once again, this is not really something that I would use in a live scenario. It's just to just shorten up the wire sustain just a little bit. Live, I wouldn't mind this, but for the studio, in this case, I did it. I removed some sustain from that mic. So I'm at minus 14% for the gain here, and then I also adjusted the release at 130 milliseconds. So that's the length of sustain that it's taking down, basically. So without this, you'll hear the wires going on for longer, and this plugin makes it shorter. You could also use a gate for this, but the reason I don't like gates is because if you hit the drum softly, there's always going to be a threshold where it acts, and this transient designer, the enveloper, is not dependent on volume, only the length. So it will sound the same whether I play it softly or loudly. So this is longer and now shorter. Together with the snare top, we have this. Sounds pretty good already. Now, for a live scenario, this would be all I do for snare, and then just compress the drum bass a bit like this. But for the studio, it can also be helpful if you want to get that little bit of more fatness if you do what I did here. So like I said earlier, I just bounced the MIDI files from the drum hits here, converted that to MIDI, and that then triggered this sampler where I have the room sample of the snare that I recorded earlier. In the mixing process, I sliced out that snare hit from the room mics. I also added some reverb to that and then bounced it into this sampler. So every time I'm hitting the snare, it's gonna make the room sound the same. And that, I think, is very important to getting that worship studio sound, because what might happen in a room acoustically is it might react differently to different hits you play. Especially if you play fast hits one after another, the room is gonna combine those hits into one room sound. But if you use just a room sample, the room's gonna sound the same every time, obviously, and that cleans up the individual hits a lot, because the attack is there from the snare top mic, and then the room is gonna sound the same too. So if we listen to just that, we have this. Yeah, let's listen to this. So this is what the triggered MIDI room sound sounds like on its own. And then, like I said earlier, the reason I bounced it is because that enables me to see the phasing of that sound. And obviously, you'll want all of your hits to be in phase with each other and to align properly. So what I did here was make sure that the initial hits line up, and then I went ahead and listened to the snare top mic and this room sample together, and again flipped the phase back and forth, and yeah, this way it sounded better. Without the phase flipped. Okay, next up on the room sample, I have an EQ. Again, I'm doing the low cut, just like with a normal snare top signal, cutting some more mids. This will always vary depending on what sound or sample exactly you're using. And then I'm also cutting some highs here and doing a high cut as well. And this helps not get too much attack into the sound, because I'm getting that from the snare top mic, and I just want the room. The room always lives in the mids, so I'm tidying those up and then adding that in with the snare top and bottom mics. So with all of these snare mics, oh sorry, I haven't talked about the distortion. This is a thing that I would only do in a studio scenario, and I'm distorting the room here just to make it sound a little bit bigger and more exciting. So I'm distorting that, which adds a little bit more highs. Then I'm also cutting those here, overdriving the signal a little bit. So in the end, the room sample, it sounds like this. And now all of the snare mics. All right, I think now is a good time to talk about the reverb send as well. As you can see, I'm sending the snare top and bottom mic into this reverb channel here at the same amount. And then just a little bit of the bounced room sample is also going into this reverb send, but less of that because it already has reverb on it from when I bounced it. So the reverb itself is triggered by a signal which sounds like this. So this is basically a dry version of the snare with just a little bit of reverb from the bounced sample. And that is then triggering this reverb plugin here. I like this bass designer from Logic. In this case, the setting is called Big Chamber. I went through a little bit of the different settings, presets they have, and then tweaked that a little bit. So I made it a bit shorter. Length is 2.4 seconds. I'm obviously cutting all of the dry signal and adding the wet signal. And then just the reverb by itself sounds like this. And that in combination with the snare top and bottom mics and the sample sounds like this. One more thing you might have just noticed is that the toms also go into this reverb send. The cool thing about using one reverb send for all of the mics is it's gonna sound, it's gonna fit together, because if you use a reverb with certain settings on one channel and a different plugin with different settings on another channel, it might sound like there are two rooms combined, which sounds unnatural. And the advantage of using one channel for reverb is that it's always gonna fit together. So the toms are also getting sent in at the same amount as the snare top and bottom mics, and we'll get to those in a minute. Next up, we have the bass drum. The dynamic mic we used already sounds very round, just dry, so let's listen to that. And now some of the mixing steps here. This is a very typical bass drum EQ as well. I'm boosting at 65 Hertz or 60 usually. Boosting that to taste, in this case 5.8 dB. Then I'm cutting some low mids at 100 Hertz minus 11 dB. Don't be afraid to make big moves like this if it helps. And then I'm also cutting some more low mids at 150 Hertz. These regions are always the same, or usually the same. There's always a lot of low mid mud in a bass drum mic, so cutting that will usually not hurt. And then I'm also boosting a little bit of attack at 4.7K. Usually around 4K would be a good place to start for that. And that now makes it sound like this. Whereas before it sounded like this. So a lot cleaner. Next up, compressor. Again, 4:1 ratio, around 30 milliseconds of attack and then 260 milliseconds of release. Usually works for bass drums. And then I'm making the needle jump the same amount as before with the snare. And this just helps tighten up the signal. I can not really explain what this does exactly, but in my opinion, with these settings, it just sounds better, so I'm doing it. Next up, we have another EQ. In this case, it's just boosting some more attack and shaping the attack a bit. This is basically just a step that I did to match it to the original recording. In a live scenario, I wouldn't do this. In this case, cutting some attack here at 2.5K, which is a little bit too low for me. Don't like this region for attack. And then I'm boosting some more at 4.6K in this case. So I'm basically removing the low attack and making it sound higher. It's basically what this EQ is. All right, next up we have the toms. As you can see, I'm panning the left tom slightly to the left, the right tom a bit more to the right, because that's how it's set up in a drum kit. First EQ here is just doing a low cut below the fundamental of the smaller tom. As you can see, this is the fundamental, this is an overtone. Then I'm compressing that with the same settings once again. Just a bit longer release because the tom has a longer sustain than the bass drum. Also, I'm compressing a bit harder here. And then the other EQ is removing the overtone I talked about earlier and also removing some attack. This is very dependent on the mics you use, and in this case, this worked, but it might not be necessary if you use different mics or different drums. But the regions are going to be the same. So 6K for attack, 240 in this case for low mids. Usually works for toms, for rack toms at least, and then the floor tom is going to be very similar. I'm also cutting here on the second EQ some low mids. Obviously they're only going to be lower. And also the attack at 6K. Compression is also the same. Only the first EQ is different because floor toms, usually with the same mics as rack toms, have a bit less fundamental. So I'm boosting a little bit of 80 Hertz in this case. And I'm also already doing in the first EQ a cut of low mids here at 180. So together, the toms on their own sound like this. Dry. All right, and then lastly we have the room. Same setting for both mics, panned hard left and right. The first EQ is removing some room modes that I don't like. Our room where we record always has the same low mid frequencies that just stand in that room, and by cutting those I'm cleaning up the signal a lot. Also I'm cutting in the mids here, 320 in this case for the snare, and this I think is triggered by the bass drum, this frequency. Yeah, not liking that either. And one trick I also like to do for room mics sometimes is doing a very slight high cut, because it's a psychological phenomenon actually that a room with a bit less highs sounds bigger than one with more highs. So I'm also cutting that. And then I'm removing 2 more of the room frequencies, but this will differ a lot from room to room. The basic idea, however, of using a stereo room setup, EQing the mics for them to sound good, and then going into a room bus can be applied to a lot of different settings. As you can see, this is the room bus. This is what the room mics sound on their own. And And then I'm using the Space Designer again with the same setting as on the reverb channel. Only in this scenario, I'm keeping the dry signal and adding the wet signal because I don't want to kill off my rooms. I just want to enhance them with some reverb. One thing I just noticed though is actually the setting is not the same. The length is different. It's a slightly different setting. But I'm using the room mics more to get kind of a natural sounding overview of the whole kit, and then getting the length of the sustain from the reverb send. Basically, I was imagining just a nice sounding studio, and that is what I was aiming for with the room mics. All right, now let's turn off these plugins here on the drum bus and take a listen to everything in combination. Oh, sorry, just the drums. Sounds pretty good already. The only thing I like to do here is compress the drum bus, again 4:1, 30:1, 30 milliseconds, and then release as at 410. Again, I'm making the needle jump between 0 and -5 dB of gain reduction, and that just helps glue everything together and make it sound just like on the records. Then the last EQ on the drum bus is very light because I want to do all of the details in the individual EQs on the mics, and then just make light changes to the end result at around maximum 3 dB. So I'm cutting 2.3 dB at 535 Hertz here, just to get rid of some mids. Also boosting the highs a little bit. And this is basically all I would do in a drum bus EQ. And the last compressor is actually off. So let's remove that now. I didn't use that for the mix. I tried it once, but I didn't like it, so it's off. All right, one more thing I like to do is take a look at the frequency analyzer. In this case, I'm using the multimeter. It might be called differently in like a digital mixer or whatever, different DAW, but in this case it's this, and it just shows all of the frequencies at the volumes that they have, the levels they have. So when we listen to the drums now, basically the number one thing I like to make sure using this plugin is that all of the fundamentals of bass drum, toms and snare are at roughly the same volume. So in this case, this is the bass drum, goes between -20 and -15. Same thing with the snare. And then same thing with both toms. If you have done this, it will ensure that the attacks, the fundamentals are going to be in the same range, which is important. Also, I pay attention to the attacks. I try to listen for just the attacks and make sure they are also at the same volume. For that, I actually like to listen at a very low volume sometimes, and until I can hear just the attack, and then compare snare attack, kick attack, and tom attack, and make sure they're also sounding the same. One thing you'll notice in general is that there are not a lot of mids in this mix. A lot of low end, a lot of high end, but not many mids. And this helps the drums sound good in the mix, obviously, where there's vocals, guitar and everything. Those live in this region, and by cutting that out of the drums, I'm making sure that when everything adds together, everything has its place, and there's no fight for frequencies. Okay, and then very lastly, here for the output, this is basically just a little bit of a mastering chain. I'm using a very light amount of compression on the whole mix. Actually, you can barely see the needle move. Might be different with the other song. Let's check that out. Just a little bit of movement. This just helps even out the peaks of the whole mix a little bit and make it sound more compressed, just a little bit. And then I'm limiting everything to 0 dB. But I try to make sure that the gain reduction does not exceed 3 dB. This helps me get everything nice and loud without sacrificing the attacks too much. Okay, let's listen back and forth between the original song and my mixes now. Now the other song. One thing that helped me get this mix in the end was actually the different sounding snares on both songs, because on Gyra the snare has a lot more highs than in Waymaker, and I try to aim right for the middle. That way, for our YouTube videos, I'm making sure that the snare is going to fit for most worship music. So the process, by the way, is the same also with the sampling for this song. Okay, I hope you learned something, and if you have any other tips or tricks you like to do for worship drum sound mixing, be sure to tell us in the comments. Also like and subscribe to this channel, and see you next time. God bless you.